The morning shift alarm buzzed through Kepler Station like it did every day. Park Min-ho rolled out of his small bunk and pulled on his maintenance uniform. The blue jumpsuit was worn and patched in several places, but it was clean. Min-ho always kept his clothes clean, even if everything else around him was falling apart. Kepler Station was one of the biggest trading posts in this part of the galaxy. Ships came and went every hour, bringing aliens from dozens of different worlds. The station never slept. There was always something broken that needed fixing, and that meant Min-ho always had work to do. He grabbed his toolbox and headed to the main corridor. The station was already busy with morning traffic. Tall, thin aliens with blue skin walked next to short, furry creatures that looked like walking bears. Flying robots buzzed overhead, carrying messages and small packages. The air smelled like a mix of different foods, engine fuel, and recycled air. Min-ho had worked on Kepler Station for 3 years. He had seen many strange things in that time, but today felt different. There was tension in the air. People were talking in hushed voices and looking toward the main docking bay. "Hey, Min-ho," called Kim Nari as she walked past. Nari worked in station security and wore the black uniform that marked her as one of the peacekeepers. "Did you hear? The hegemony is bringing in some kind of prisoner today." The Galactic Hegemony was like the police force for this part of space. They were supposed to keep order and make sure everyone followed the law, but Min-ho had heard stories about them. Stories that made him uncomfortable. "What kind of prisoner?" Min-ho asked. "I don't know yet. Something about a public example. They want everyone to see," Nari frowned. "I don't like it when they do things like this." Before Min-ho could ask more questions, a loud announcement echoed through the station. "All residents and visitors report to the main plaza for an important demonstration. This is mandatory by order of the Galactic Hegemony," Min-ho sighed. He had pipes to fix in Section 7, but it looked like that would have to wait. He followed the crowd toward the main plaza, which was really just a big open area near the food court where people usually ate lunch. When he got there, Min-ho saw something that made his stomach turn. In the center of the plaza stood a tall metal cage surrounded by energy barriers. The cage was barely big enough for someone to stand up in, and inside was a young alien girl. She was unlike any species Min-ho had seen before. Her skin looked like it was made of pale crystals that caught the light and threw it back in soft colors. She had large, dark eyes and thin arms that ended in delicate hands with too many fingers. She was small, maybe the size of a human teenager, and she was clearly terrified. Standing next to the cage was Captain Zexthal, a hegemony officer that Min-ho recognized. Zexthal was part of a species that looked like giant insects walking on 2 legs. His voice was harsh and mechanical when he spoke through his translator device. "Citizens of Kepler Station," Zexthal announced, "this creature is a terrorist sympathizer. Her family harbored enemies of the hegemony. She will remain here as an example of what happens to those who support chaos and rebellion." The alien girl in the cage pressed herself against the back wall. Her crystal skin had turned a dull gray color, and Min-ho could see that she was shaking. "She will be fed basic rations and given water," Zexthal continued. "But she is not to be treated with kindness. She is here to learn the price of supporting terrorists. Anyone who interferes with this justice will face consequences." Some of the aliens in the crowd began to laugh. A few even started making nasty comments about the girl. Min-ho watched in horror as someone threw a piece of garbage at the cage. The girl flinched and tried to make herself even smaller. "What's her name?" called out someone from the crowd. "Her designation is irrelevant," Zexthal replied. "She is a criminal. That is all you need to know." But Min-ho heard one of the other hegemony guards whisper to his partner. The name sounded like Veltara. In their clicking language. As the crowd began to break up, many aliens stayed behind to stare at the girl and make jokes. Some of the younger ones from different species started throwing small objects at the cage. The energy barrier stopped most things from getting through, but the girl still jumped every time something hit it. Min-ho felt sick. He wanted to say something, to tell them to stop, but there were so many of them. And Captain Zexthel was still watching from nearby. He went back to his work, but he couldn't concentrate. Every time he tried to focus on fixing a broken pipe or replacing a burnt-out light, he thought about the girl in the cage. Her name was Veltara, and she was alone and scared. During his lunch break, Minho walked back to the plaza. The crowd had gotten bigger. Someone had set up chairs so people could sit and watch the girl like she was some kind of entertainment. They were eating their lunch and pointing at her. Veltara was sitting in the corner of her cage with her knees pulled up to her chest. A small bowl of what looked like gray paste had been pushed through a slot in the bottom of the cage. She hadn't touched it. "Look at it just sitting there," laughed a red-skinned alien with 4 arms. "Maybe it's too good for real food?" "My people would have eaten that garbage in seconds," said another alien. "These crystal creatures are too soft." Minho bought his usual lunch from the food court, rice, some vegetables, and a piece of cooked fish. It wasn't fancy, but it was good and filling. He found an empty table and sat down, but he couldn't eat while watching what was happening to Veltara. More people gathered around the cage as the day went on. They treated it like a show. Some brought their children to see what happens to bad aliens. The children threw things at the cage while their parents laughed. Veltara never looked up. She just sat there, getting smaller and smaller as her crystal skin grew duller. By evening, Minho couldn't stand it anymore. He had tried to focus on his work, but every job took him past the plaza. Every time he walked by, he saw more cruelty, more laughter, more people treating a scared young girl like she wasn't even alive. The worst part was that some humans were joining in. Minho had always thought humans were better than this. He had always believed that his people understood kindness and fairness. But here they were laughing along with everyone else. That night, Minho lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. He kept thinking about Veltara's eyes. They were so big and dark and they looked so lost. She was somebody's daughter. Maybe somebody's sister. She had a name and feelings and dreams, just like any other person. The station's night cycle began, and the lights dimmed to simulate darkness. But Minho knew that Veltara was still sitting in that cage, still afraid, still alone. The plaza never completely emptied. There were always a few aliens hanging around, waiting for her to do something they could laugh at. Minho closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but all he could see was that dull gray crystal skin and those frightened eyes. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same cruelty, and he didn't know if he could watch it happen again. Something had to change. Someone had to do something. Maybe that someone was him. 3 days passed and nothing changed. Every morning, Minho walked through the plaza on his way to work and saw Veltara still curled up in her cage. Every evening, he walked back the same way and saw her in the exact same position. The crowds around her cage had grown larger. Word had spread throughout the station that there was free entertainment in the main plaza. Aliens from visiting ships made special trips to see the terrorist sympathizer and throw insults at her. Veltara had not touched most of the gray paste they gave her. The bowl from yesterday was still sitting in the corner, untouched and growing. Some kind of mold? Her crystal skin had gotten even duller, and Minho could see that she was getting thinner. "She's going to die if this keeps up," Minho said to himself as he watched her from across the plaza. "What did you say?" asked Li Jiwan, one of the station administrators. Jiwan was a practical woman who usually focused on keeping the station running smoothly. She didn't like problems, and she definitely didn't like getting involved in hegemony business. "Nothing," Minho said quickly. "Just talking to myself," but Jiwan had heard him. "Look, Minho, I know this whole thing makes you uncomfortable. It makes a lot of us uncomfortable, but there's nothing we can do about it. The hegemony has legal authority here." "Legal doesn't always mean right," Minho said quietly. Jiwan looked around nervously. "Don't say things like that where people can hear you. Captain Zexthel is still around, and he's been asking questions about station personnel. Just do your job and stay out of trouble." Minho nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He was watching Veltara again. She had lifted her head slightly and was looking at the bowl of paste. For a moment, it seemed like she might try to eat something. But then a group of young aliens ran past the cage, shouting and banging on the energy barrier. She jerked back into her corner and covered her head with her thin arms that afternoon. During his lunch break, Minho made a decision. He bought his usual meal from the food court, but instead of finding a table away from the crowd, he walked straight toward the cage. The aliens gathered around Veltara were having a great time. Someone had brought what looked like rotten fruit to throw at the energy barrier. Others were making loud noises to try to startle her. A few were taking pictures to send to friends on other stations. "Hey, look!" called out one of them as Minho approached. "The human wants to join the fun." Minho ignored them. He walked right up to the cage and knelt down near the feeding slot where they pushed her food through. Veltara looked up at him with those big, dark eyes. Up close, he could see that they weren't completely black. There were tiny flecks of color in them, like stars in a night sky. "What are you doing?" asked the red-skinned alien with 4 arms. "You can't get that close to the prisoner." Minho reached into his lunch container and pulled out a piece of his fish. It was cooked perfectly and still warm. He held it near the feeding slot and looked directly at Veltara. "Come eat with me," he said softly. The crowd around the cage went quiet. They weren't sure what Minho was doing, but it definitely wasn't what they expected. Veltara stared at him for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she moved toward the front of the cage. Her movements were careful and shaky, like she expected someone to hit her at any moment. "Are you crazy?" laughed one of the aliens in the crowd. "It's a terrorist. You can't share food with it." "She's not an it," Minho said calmly. "She's a person and she's hungry." He pushed the piece of fish through the feeding slot. Veltara looked at it, then at him, then back at the fish. Very carefully she picked it up with her delicate fingers and took a small bite. The taste seemed to surprise her. Her crystal skin flickered with just a tiny bit of color, like a candle being lit in a dark room. She took another bite, and then another. "This is illegal," shouted someone from the crowd. "You're interfering with hegemony justice." "I'm sharing my lunch," Minho replied. "There's no law against being kind." But the crowd was getting angry. More aliens were gathering around, and they were starting to shout. Some of them were calling for Captain Zexel to come and stop Minho. Minho didn't move. He pulled out some of his rice and vegetables and pushed them through the slot as well. Veltara was eating slowly, but she was eating. For the first time in 3 days, she was actually consuming food. "You're making a big mistake, human," said a voice behind him. Mite turned around and saw Captain Zexel pushing through the crowd. The tall insect-like officer moved with sharp, angry movements. His translator device crackled as he spoke. "Step away from the prisoner," Zexel ordered. "You are interfering with a lawful punishment." "I'm sharing my food with someone who's hungry," Minho said, standing up but not moving away from the cage. "Is that against your law?" Zexel's insect eyes focused on him with obvious irritation. "The prisoner receives adequate nutrition. Your interference is not required." "That gray paste isn't adequate for her species," Minho said. "Look at her. She's wasting away. The prisoner's condition is irrelevant. She is here to serve as an example. Your actions undermine that purpose." Minho looked around at the crowd. They were all watching him now, waiting to see what he would do. Some looked angry that he was ruining their entertainment. Others looked curious. A few looked uncomfortable, like they were starting to realize that what was happening wasn't right. "Maybe," Minho said carefully, "the example should be about kindness instead of cruelty." The crowd began to murmur. Zexel's translator crackled with what sounded like angry clicking noises. "You will stop this behavior immediately," the captain ordered. "Any further interference will result in charges against you." Minho looked back at Veltara. She had finished eating the fish and rice he had given her. The tiny bit of color in her crystal skin was a little brighter now. She was looking at him with something that might have been gratitude. "I understand," Minho said to Zexel. Then he turned back to Veltara and spoke in the few words of her language that he had learned from the station's computer database. "Veltara, friend, tomorrow." Her eyes went wide when she heard her name. No one had called her by her name since she had been brought to the station. Everyone else just called her the prisoner or it or worse things. Minho packed up his lunch container and walked away from the cage. The crowd was still murmuring and pointing. Captain Zexthel watched him go with obvious displeasure, but as Minho left the plaza, he heard something that made him smile. Behind him, very quietly, Valtara whispered a single word in her own language. The station's translator picked it up and converted it to standard speech. "Thank you." That evening, as Minho lay in his bunk, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he had done something that mattered. Something right. Tomorrow, he would bring lunch again. And maybe, if he was lucky, he wouldn't be the only one. The next morning, Minho woke up earlier than usual. He had been thinking about Valtara all night, wondering if she was okay, if she was cold, if she was scared. The station's night cycle could get chilly, and he doubted the hegemony had given her any kind of blanket. He got dressed and headed to the food court before starting his work shift. The plaza was mostly empty at this early hour, with just a few maintenance workers like himself grabbing quick breakfast before their jobs began. Valtara was awake. She was sitting near the front of her cage, watching the few people who walked by. When she saw Minho approaching with a food container, her crystal skin flickered with a tiny bit of color. "Good morning," Minho said softly as he knelt by the feeding slot. He had brought her some bread, fruit, and a piece of cheese. Real food, not the gray paste that sat molding in the corner of her cage. As Valtara ate, Minho noticed something different about her. She seemed more alert, more present. Yesterday's food had helped, but there was something else. She was looking at him like she was trying to understand who he was and why he was being kind to her. "You came back?" she whispered in her language. The station's translator converted her words to standard speech. "I said I would," Minho replied. From across the plaza, Kim Nari was watching them. She had been on night shift and was heading back to her quarters when she saw Minho feeding the prisoner again. Instead of continuing to her room, she stopped and observed what was happening. Nari had been uncomfortable with the whole situation from the beginning. She was a security officer, which meant she was supposed to keep order on the station. But this didn't feel like order. This felt like organized cruelty. After Minho left to start his work shift, Nari walked over to the cage. Valtara looked up at her with nervous eyes. Security officers usually meant trouble. "What's your real story?" Nari asked quietly. "What did you actually do?" Valtara was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice so soft that Nari had to lean closer to hear. "My family helped people," Valtara said. "Refugees from the war zones. We gave them food and medicine. The hegemony said we were helping terrorists, but they were just families with children who had nowhere to go." Nari frowned. "That's what they arrested you for? Helping refugees?" "They wanted us to tell them where the refugee camps were located. When we refused, they took me." Valtara's skin flickered with darker colors. "They said I would stay in cages like this until my family cooperated. But my family doesn't know where I am." This wasn't the story Captain Zexthel had told. He had said Valtara was a terrorist sympathizer, someone who actively supported violence against the hegemony. But helping refugees wasn't terrorism. It was just being decent. Nari spent the rest of her off-duty time in the station's records office, looking up information about Valtara's case. What she found made her angry. The official reports were full of vague language and accusations, but there was no real evidence of any criminal activity. Just a family that had refused to betray the location of innocent refugees. Meanwhile, Song Yuna was having her own moment of realization. Yuna worked in the station's communications center, and part of her job was monitoring transmissions to make sure nothing illegal or dangerous was being broadcast. She had been listening to conversations between various species on the station, and she kept hearing references to the crystal girl in the plaza. Most of the talk was cruel gossip and jokes, but some of it was different. A few aliens were asking questions about Catherian culture and customs. Yuna decided to do some research of her own. What she found surprised her. The Catherian species had very specific cultural traditions around food and eating. Sharing a meal with someone wasn't just being polite, it was a sacred act that created deep emotional bonds. In their culture, refusing to eat with someone was like rejecting their friendship, while accepting shared food was like accepting them as family. When Minho had offered food to Veltara, he hadn't just been kind. He had performed one of the most important social rituals in her culture. He had essentially adopted her as family, at least in the Catherian understanding of relationships. That afternoon, during lunchtime, more people gathered around Veltara's cage than usual. Word was spreading through the station about the human, who was sharing his meals with the prisoner. Some came to mock Minho if he showed up again. Others came out of curiosity. When Minho arrived with his lunch, the crowd was already waiting. There were probably 50 aliens and humans gathered around the plaza, all watching to see what would happen. Minho ignored them. He walked to the cage, knelt down, and began sharing his food with Veltara just like he had the day before. But this time, something different happened. A small, furry alien that looked like a walking teddy bear approached the cage. It was carrying a piece of fruit that looked like it came from its homeworld. Without saying anything, it placed the fruit near the feeding slot and walked away. Then an elderly human woman stepped forward. She had been watching from one of the nearby tables, and she looked uncomfortable with all the attention. But she put a small container of soup near the cage and nodded to Veltara before quickly walking away. One by one, other beings began to approach. Not all of them. Most of the crowd was still there to watch and judge. But a few individuals decided to follow Minho's example. They brought small offerings of food and left them by the cage. Captain Zexthal arrived just as the fifth person was leaving food for Veltara. His mechanical voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "I ordered that there would be no interference with the prisoner." "We're just sharing our food," said the elderly human woman, her voice shaky but determined. "There's no law against kindness." "There is a law against undermining hegemony authority," Zexthal replied. His insect eyes swept across the small group of people who had brought food. "All of you will be reported for interfering with official punishment." But something had changed in the crowd. Instead of laughing and supporting the captain, many of the onlookers were quiet and thoughtful. They were looking at Veltara differently now. Instead of seeing a faceless enemy, they were starting to see a scared young girl who was grateful for small acts of kindness. "Maybe," said a blue-skinned alien that Minho didn't recognize, "we should be asking why she's really here. What did she actually do?" "That is not your concern," Zexthal snapped. "The hegemony's justice is not open to debate by civilians." "Justice should always be open to questions," Nari said as she pushed through the crowd. She was wearing her security uniform, which gave her words more weight, especially when it involves a minor. "A minor?" asked someone from the crowd. "She's barely an adult by Catherian standards," Nari continued. "And according to the records I've been able to access, her only crime was refusing to betray the location of refugee camps." The murmur in the crowd grew louder. This wasn't the story they had been told? They had been told she was a terrorist sympathizer, someone dangerous who deserved punishment. But a young girl who refused to betray refugees? That was different. Zexthal S. Translator crackled with angry noises. "Security Officer Nari, you are overstepping your authority. Return to your duties immediately." "My duty is to keep order on this station," Nari replied. "And this doesn't feel like order. This feels like cruelty." The captain looked around at the crowd, at the small pile of food offerings by the cage, at the faces that were no longer laughing at his prisoner. Something was changing, and he didn't like it. "This demonstration is over," he announced. "Return to your activities. Anyone found lingering in this area will be detained for questioning." The crowd began to break up, but slowly and reluctantly. As people walked away, many of them looked back at Veltara with expressions that were very different from the cruel amusement they had shown before. Minho finished sharing his lunch and stood up to leave. As he walked away, he heard Veltara whisper something in her language. The translator picked it up. "The kindness grows." She was right. Something was growing on Kepler Station, and Captain Zexthal's threats weren't going to stop it. Kim Nari couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Veltara had told her about helping refugees, and how different that story was from the official reports. As a security officer, Nari had access to more detailed records than most station personnel. But even her access was limited when it came to hegemony operations. She decided to dig deeper the next morning. Instead of going off duty after her night shift, Nari went to Li Jiwan's office. Jiwan was already at her desk, reviewing supply manifests and docking schedules. She looked up with surprise when Nari knocked on her door. "Shouldn't you be sleeping?" Jiwan asked. "You worked all night." "I need to ask you about something," Nari said, closing the door behind her. "The prisoner in the plaza. Have you read her actual case file?" Jiwan's expression grew uncomfortable. "Nari, we've talked about this. It's not our business. The hegemony handles their own legal matters, but we're hosting the punishment on our station. Doesn't that make it our business?" Nari sat down across from Jiwan's desk. "I've been looking at the public records and something doesn't add up. The charges are vague and there's no real evidence presented." "What are you asking me to do?" Jiwan said carefully. "Help me access the full case files. You have administrative clearance that I don't. If this girl is really a terrorist, then fine, but if she's not ... Jiwan was quiet for a long moment. She was a practical person who didn't like complications, but she was also fair. The situation with Veltara had been bothering her too, especially after seeing Minho's simple act of kindness and how it had affected other people on the station. "If I help you with this," Jiwan said finally, "and the hegemony finds out, it could cause serious problems for both of us." "I know," Nari replied, "but I can't stop thinking about what she told me. Her family was helping refugees, and they took her to force her family to cooperate. That's not justice, that's hostage-taking." Yuan sighed and turned to her computer terminal. "Give me a few minutes. The hegemony files are heavily encrypted, but I might be able to access some of the background documentation." While Jiwan worked at her computer, Nari walked to the window that looked out over the main plaza. Even from this high up, she could see Veltara's cage. A small crowd was already gathering, waiting for the day's entertainment to begin. But today, the crowd looked different. Instead of just gathering around the cage to mock and throw things, some people were keeping their distance. Others were standing in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. The mood had changed since Minho had started sharing his meals with Veltara. "Here," Jiwan said, calling Nari back to the desk. "I found something. This is a preliminary report filed before the official charges were made." Nari read over Jiwan's shoulder. The preliminary report told a very different story than the official version. According to this document, Veltara's family ran a medical clinic on their home planet. When refugees from nearby war zones started arriving, seeking treatment for injuries and illness, the family provided care without asking questions about politics or allegiances. The hegemony had demanded that the clinic provide information about the refugees, including their identities and where they were staying. When Veltara's family refused, citing medical ethics and patient confidentiality, the hegemony classified them as terrorist sympathizers. "This is horrible," Nari said. They arrested her for refusing to violate medical ethics. Her family were doctors helping injured people. "Keep reading," Jiwan said grimly. The report got worse. Veltara had been taken not because of anything she personally had done, but as leverage against her family. The hegemony hoped that seeing their daughter in public punishment would force her parents to cooperate and reveal information about the refugees they had treated. "This is kidnapping," Nari said. "They took a child to blackmail her parents." Before Jiwan could respond, there was a soft knock on the office door. They both froze, afraid that Captain Zexthal or another hegemony officer had discovered what they were doing. "Come in," Jiwan called out, trying to sound normal. The door opened, and Choi Hyuk entered. Hyuk was the station's chief medical officer, a quiet man who usually kept to himself. He looked nervous and kept glancing over his shoulder. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I need to talk to someone about the prisoner in the plaza. I've been observing her condition, and I'm concerned." "What kind of concerns?" Nari asked. Hyuk closed the door and moved closer to Jiwan's desk. She's showing signs of a condition specific to Catherian physiology? Their species requires certain minerals and nutrients that aren't present in the standard rations the hegemony is providing. If she doesn't get proper nutrition soon, she could suffer permanent damage. What kind of damage? Jiwan asked. Their crystal-like skin isn't just for appearance. It's part of their nervous system. When they don't get proper nutrition, it starts to dull and lose function. If it gets bad enough, they can lose the ability to communicate properly or even to feel emotions normally. Nari felt sick. So they're not just keeping her in a cage for display. They're slowly causing brain damage. I don't think they understand Catherian biology well enough to know that, Hyuk said. But ignorance doesn't make it less harmful. I've tried to approach Captain Zexthal about adjusting her diet, but he won't speak with me. What does she need? Jiwan asked. Hyuk pulled out a small datapad. I've been researching Catherian nutritional requirements. They need foods rich in certain crystalline minerals plus specific types of proteins and vitamins. The closest we can get with station supplies would be, well, actually, the meals that maintenance worker has been sharing with her are much better for her than anything the hegemony is providing. Minho, Nari said. His name is Park Minho. Right, his meals contain fish, rice, and vegetables that have many of the nutrients she needs. It's probably the only thing keeping her healthy right now. Jiwan leaned back in her chair, processing everything they had discovered. So let me understand this. The hegemony has kidnapped a young medical student whose only crime was having parents who wouldn't violate patient confidentiality. They're keeping her in conditions that are slowly causing neurological damage. And the only thing preventing permanent harm is a maintenance worker sharing his lunch with her. That's about right, Nari confirmed. And if Captain Zexthal finds out we know all this ... double quotes Jiwan added. He'll probably arrest us too, Hyuk finished. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, considering the implications of what they had learned. Finally, Nari spoke up. We can't just keep this information to ourselves. Other people on the station have a right to know what's really happening. But if we spread this around openly, the hegemony will shut us down before anyone can act on it, Jiwan pointed out. Then we need to be smart about it, Nari said. We need to build support quietly and carefully. Get people thinking and asking questions. Hyuk nodded. I can start with the medical staff. Most doctors would be horrified to learn about the nutritional abuse, regardless of politics. I can work with the administrative staff, Jiwan added. People who have access to records and communication systems. And I'll talk to security personnel and maintenance workers, Nari said. People like Minho who already have doubts about what's happening. As they made their plans, none of them noticed the small listening device that had been placed behind Jiwan's desk. Captain Zexthal was more thorough than they had realized, and he was already aware that station personnel were asking uncomfortable questions, but he had underestimated how quickly word could spread when people learned the truth about injustice. And he had definitely underestimated the determination of humans, who had decided that something was wrong. The investigation had begun, and it was going to change everything on Kepler Station. Word spread through Kepler Station like electricity through circuits. Not loudly or obviously, but in quiet conversations in maintenance tunnels, medical offices, and supply rooms. People who had been uncomfortable with the situation but afraid to speak up were discovering that they weren't alone. Song Yuna had become the unofficial coordinator of information. Her job in communications gave her access to the station's internal networks, and she used that access carefully. She created secure channels where station personnel could share what they had learned about Valtara's case without being detected by hegemony. Monitoring systems. The truth was spreading. Valtara wasn't a terrorist. She was a hostage. Hun Deho was one of the first to join their quiet movement. Deho was an older human who had been trading goods between different worlds for 20 years. He had seen the hegemony's version of justice before, and he knew how to recognize lies when he heard them. I've dealt with Catherians for years, he told Nari during a private conversation in the cargo bay. They're peaceful people. They're whole. Culture is built around healing and helping others. The idea that one of them would support violence? It doesn't make sense. What do you know about their family structures? Nari asked. They're very close-knit. Taking a child from a Catherian family is one of the cruelest things you could do. It would be like cutting off a limb. Deho's weathered face was grim. If the hegemony has her parents' daughter, they'll do anything to get her back, even betraying refugees who trust them. This information helped explain why the hegemony had chosen Veltara as their leverage. They weren't just punishing her family, they were trying to break them emotionally. Meanwhile, Minho continued his daily routine of sharing lunch with Veltara, but now he wasn't alone. More people were joining him each day, bringing food and sitting quietly near the cage during their break times. It started small. On the fourth day, 3 other humans brought their lunches to the plaza and ate near Veltara's cage without saying much. On the 5th day, 2 alien species joined them. By the end of the week, there were usually 8 to 10 people eating. Lunch in solidarity with the imprisoned girl. They didn't make speeches or carry signs. They just ate their meals peacefully while Veltara ate hers. But their quiet presence was powerful. Other people walking through the plaza could see that the mood had changed. Instead of cruel entertainment, this was becoming something else. Entirely. Captain Zexthal was growing more agitated each day. The listening device in Jiwan's office had given him some information about the station personnel's activities, but not enough to make arrest. They were being too careful, and their actions weren't technically illegal. The situation is becoming problematic, he reported to his superiors via secure communication. Local personnel are showing sympathy for the prisoner. This undermines the psychological impact of the punishment. The response from Hegemony headquarters was clear: maintain control at all costs. If necessary, expand the punishment to include anyone who interfered with their operations. But Zexthal was beginning to realize that interference might include half the station's population. On the 7th day, something unexpected happened. Veltara spoke up during lunchtime. She had been getting stronger and more alert thanks to the proper nutrition she was receiving from the shared meals. Her crystal skin had regained some of its natural luster, and her voice was clearer when she used the translator. Why are you helping me? She asked the small group of people eating near her cage. It was Minho who answered first. Because it's the right thing to do. But you don't know me, Veltara said. You don't know my family. Why do you care what happens to someone you've never met? An elderly alien with purple skin and kind eyes spoke up. Her species was one that Minho didn't recognize, but her voice was warm and gentle. Child, when we see someone suffering, we don't need to know their life story to know that suffering is wrong. My people believe, added a blue-skinned trader, that helping others is how we prove we deserve help ourselves. Veltara was quiet for a moment, absorbing these responses. Then she said something that made everyone stop eating and pay attention. My parents taught me that the measure of a civilization isn't how they treat their friends. It's how they treat their enemies. She looked around at the group. But I'm not even your enemy. I'm just a stranger, and you're treating me like family? Catherian culture, said Song Yuna, who had joined them that day. Sharing food creates family bonds, doesn't it? Veltara's skin flickered with warm colors. Yes, when someone offers you food, they're offering you a place in their heart. When you accept it, you're accepting them as ... as chosen family. Then I guess we're all family now, Minho said simply. The conversation was overheard by other people in the plaza, and word of it spread quickly through the station. The idea that this scared young girl considered them family, and that they had created family bonds simply by sharing meals, resonated with many species' cultural values. That afternoon, Captain Zexthal made his move. He arrived in the plaza with 4 additional hegemony guards and a portable announcement system. Attention all Kepler station personnel, he broadcast. Effective immediately, gathering within 50 meters of the prisoner is prohibited. Anyone found violating this order will be detained for questioning about terrorist sympathies. The small group eating lunch near Veltara's cage looked at each other uncertainly. The new guards were positioning themselves in a circle around the area, making it clear that they meant business, but instead of dispersing, something unexpected happened. More people began walking into the plaza. Station personnel who had been watching from a distance decided that this was the moment to take a stand. Han Deho was the first to cross the 50-meter line. He walked slowly and deliberately, carrying his lunch, and sat down exactly where he had been sitting for the past 3 days. "This is my usual lunch spot," he said calmly to the guards. "I eat here every day." Kim Nari came next, still in her security uniform. "I'm conducting a safety inspection of this area," she announced. "Standard protocol requires me to observe crowd conditions." One by one, other station personnel found reasons to be in the prohibited zone. Some claimed they were doing maintenance work. Others said they were conducting surveys or inspections. A few simply said they were exercising their right to use public areas of the station within minutes. There were more people in the prohibited zone than there had been before the restriction was announced. Captain Zexthel's translator crackled with angry noises. This wasn't how his plan was supposed to work. He had expected people to be intimidated by the increased security presence. "All of you are in violation of hegemony orders," he announced. "Disperse immediately or face arrest." "Arrest us for what?" asked Li Jiwan, who had left her office to join the group. "We're station personnel conducting our normal duties in a public area." "You are interfering with official punishment," Zextel replied. "We're eating lunch," Minho said, taking a bite of his sandwich to emphasize the point. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. The hegemony guards had weapons and authority, but they were vastly outnumbered. More importantly, everyone in the plaza was being carefully nonviolent and non-confrontational. They were just Darganli. Zextel made a decision that he would later regret. "Very well. If you insist on gathering here, you will all remain here. No one leaves this plaza until I decide otherwise. Guards, establish a perimeter." These people are now under protective detention. What he meant as a threat, the station personnel heard as an opportunity. If they were all going to be trapped in the plaza together, they might as well make it comfortable. Within an hour, people were bringing blankets, more food, and even some musical instruments. The protective detention was starting to look more like a community picnic, and at the center of it all, Veltara watched with growing amazement as dozens of strangers chose to be imprisoned alongside her rather than abandon her to face her. "Punishment alone?" "The kindness grows," she whispered, and this time everyone could hear the joy in her voice. The protective detention in the plaza had been going on for 6 hours. What Captain Zextel had intended as punishment had become something entirely different. The station personnel weren't acting like prisoners. They were acting like a community. Someone had brought a portable cooking unit, and people were sharing meals with each other and with Veltara. Others had brought work tablets so they could continue their duties from the plaza. A few had even brought games and entertainment to pass the time. Children from the various alien families on the station had been brought by their parents, and they were playing games near Veltara's cage. She watched them with fascination, occasionally calling out suggestions or encouragement in her improving standard language. "This isn't working," one of the hegemony guards muttered to another in their private channel. "They're not acting like prisoners. They're acting like they're at a festival." Captain Zextel was growing desperate. His superiors were demanding updates, and he had no idea how to explain that his attempt to control the situation had only made it worse. The entire plaza was now filled with people who were openly defying his authority, but they were doing it so peacefully and cheerfully that he couldn't justify using force against them. That's when Song Yuna made her move. She had been working quietly on her communication tablet, using her access to the station's broadcasting system to compile all the evidence they had gathered about Veltara's case. Now, with dozens of witnesses present and the situation stable, she decided it was time to share the truth with everyone. "Attention everyone in the plaza," she announced, standing up with her tablet in hand. "I have information about why Veltara is really here." The conversation in the plaza died down as people turned to listen. Even some of the hegemony guards seemed curious about what she was going to say. 8 days ago, Captain Zexthal told us that Valtara was a terrorist sympathizer whose family harbored enemies of the hegemony. But that's not the whole truth. Zexthal's translator crackled angrily. You will stop this immediately. Classified information cannot be— This isn't classified, Una interrupted. This is public record data that anyone can access if they know where to look. She held up her tablet. Valtara's family operates medical clinics on 3 different worlds. When refugees from war zones started arriving, seeking treatment for injuries and illness, her family provided medical care. She began reading from the preliminary reports that Jawan had helped her access. The hegemony demanded that the clinics provide patient information, including names, medical conditions, and locations where the refugees were staying. When Valtara's family refused, citing medical ethics and patient confidentiality, they were classified as terrorist sympathizers. Murmurs began rippling through the crowd. This wasn't the story they had been told. Valtara herself is a medical student, Una continued. She was taken not because of anything she had done, but as leverage to force her family to violate their medical ethics and betray their patients. Those are lies, Zexthal shouted. The prisoner is a known terrorist associate. Then show us the evidence, Kim Nari challenged, standing up to face the captain. Show us proof of any violent acts or terrorist connections. Zexthal's insect-like features twitched with agitation. The evidence is classified for security reasons. How convenient, said Handeho dryly. Evidence that's too secret to share, about crimes too dangerous to describe. Committed by a medical student whose only crime was having parents who won't betray their patients. The crowd was becoming more restless. People were looking at Valtara with very different eyes now. Instead of seeing a terrorist, they were seeing a young woman whose family had been targeted for being too ethical to compromise their medical oath. But Song Yuna wasn't finished. There's more, she said, pulling up additional files on her tablet. I've been researching similar cases throughout hegemony space. In the past 2 years, they've taken more than 50 individuals from families who refused to cooperate with their investigations. None of them have been charged with actual crimes. They're all hostages. She began reading names and brief descriptions of other cases. A teacher whose parents wouldn't reveal which of their students came from refugee families. An engineer whose siblings wouldn't sabotage infrastructure in contested territories. A young artist whose family ran an orphanage and refused to turn. Over children who might have parents fighting against the hegemony. With each case she read, the crowd grew more agitated. These weren't terrorists being punished. These were innocent people being tortured to manipulate their families. This is propaganda, Zexthal declared. Lies designed to undermine legitimate authority. Then let's ask someone who would know, said a voice from the back of the crowd. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Walking through the gathered people was Ambassador Quinder, a tall, graceful alien with silver skin and flowing robes. Quinder was a diplomatic representative from one of the more influential species in this sector, and he had been staying on Kepler Station while negotiating trade agreements. Ambassador, Zexthal said, his tone immediately becoming more respectful. This situation is under control. There's no need for diplomatic intervention. I disagree, Quinder replied calmly. I've been observing this situation for several days, and I have questions about the legitimacy of this punishment. He walked directly to Valtara's cage and knelt down to speak with her directly. Child, will you tell me your story? In your own words? Valtara looked nervous about speaking to such an important figure, but she began to explain what had happened to her family. She spoke about the medical clinics, the refugees who came seeking help, and the impossible choice the hegemony had given her parents, betray their patients or lose their daughter. As she spoke, her crystal skin flickered with colors that reflected her emotions. Sadness when she talked about being taken from her family, fear when she described the threats made against her parents, and gratitude when she looked at the humans and aliens who had chosen to stay with her in the plaza. When she finished, Ambassador Quinder was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and faced Captain Zexthal. Captain, I've heard the official charges against this individual, and I've now heard her personal account. I've also heard evidence presented by station personnel about similar cases throughout your jurisdiction. His voice was diplomatic but firm. As a representative of the Galactic Trade Alliance, I'm formally requesting a full review of this case and all related cases. You have no authority to interfere with hegemony justice, Zexthel replied, but his voice sounded less confident than before. I have the authority to protect the interests of Alliance members, Quinder said. And several of the species whose family members have been taken are Alliance members. If the hegemony is systematically taking hostages to coerce cooperation that violates multiple interstellar treaties. The crowd was buzzing with excitement now. This wasn't just about Valtara anymore. This was about a pattern of abuse that affected multiple worlds and species. Song Yuna seized the moment. I'm broadcasting all of this information to news services. Throughout the sector, she announced, people have a right to know what's happening. You cannot, Zexthel began, but Yuna cut him off. I'm a licensed communications officer on a neutral station, she said. Broadcasting factual information is part of my job. Within minutes, Yuna's broadcast was being picked up by news services, independent journalists, and communication networks. Throughout the sector, the story of the maintenance worker who shared his lunch with an imprisoned girl was spreading across multiple star systems, along with evidence of the hegemony's systematic abuse of innocent people. Back in the plaza, Valtara was crying. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. For the first time since her capture, she believed that she might actually see her family again. Thank you, she whispered to the crowd. Thank you all. And in that moment, everyone in the plaza understood that they had become part of something much bigger than themselves. They had become part of a movement that would change the galaxy. The response to Song Yuna's broadcast was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, communication networks across dozens of star systems were carrying the story. News services picked up the footage of the peaceful gathering in the plaza, the evidence of systematic hostage-taking, and Ambassador Quinder's formal challenge to hegemony authority, but the hegemony's response was swift and harsh. Captain Zexthel received new orders that made his mechanical voice even more menacing than usual. He stood before the crowd in the plaza with a squad of heavily armed enforcement officers who had arrived on an emergency transport. By order of Hegemony High Command, he announced, this station is now under martial law. All civilian communications are suspended. Anyone found spreading anti-hegemony propaganda will be arrested immediately. The new guards weren't like the ones who had been stationed on Kepler before. These were combat troops, armed with weapons designed to pacify entire populations. They moved with military precision as they established control points throughout the station. Furthermore, Zexthel continued, the execution of the terrorist sympathizer will proceed immediately. This will serve as an example of what happens to those who defy legitimate authority. The crowd in the plaza went silent. Execution. They had all known this was a possibility. But hearing it announced so coldly made it real. Valtara pressed herself against the back of her cage, her crystal skin flickering between gray and deep purple colors that everyone now understood indicated fear and despair. You can't do this, Minho said, standing up from where he had been sitting. She's just a child. She's done nothing wrong. The prisoner's age is irrelevant, Zexthel replied. She is guilty of terrorist sympathy by association. The sentence is death. Then you'll have to execute all of us, said Kim Nari, standing beside Minho. Because we're all guilty of terrorist sympathy by association now. That can be arranged, Zexthel said coldly, but as his words echoed through the plaza, something extraordinary happened. Instead of being frightened into submission, more people stood up. First the humans who had been part of the original group sharing meals with Valtara. Then the aliens who had joined them over the past week. Then station personnel who had been watching from the sidelines but had never directly participated. One by one, dozens of beings stood up and moved closer to Valtara's cage. They formed a protective circle around her, making it clear that anyone who wanted to harm her would have to go through them first. "Stand down immediately," ordered the lead enforcement officer, raising his weapon. "Disperse or we will use force." "No," said Li Jiwan simply. She had left her administrative duties to join the circle around Veltara. "We won't stand down." "We won't let you hurt her," added Choi Hyuk, the medical officer. Handeho stepped forward, his weathered face calm but determined. "I've been traveling between worlds for 20 years. I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while authorities abuse their power. It always gets worse. More people were arriving in the plaza. Word had spread throughout the station about the planned execution, and beings who had never been involved in the situation before were coming to see what was happening. Some came out of curiosity, but many came because they had been moved by the story of the maintenance worker who shared his lunch with a prisoner, and the community that had grown around that simple act of kindness. "This is your final warning," the enforcement officer announced. "Disperse immediately or face the consequences." But instead of dispersing, the crowd grew larger. Families arrived with their children. Traders and merchants closed their shops to join the gathering. Even some of the aliens who had initially participated in mocking Veltara came forward, looking ashamed but determined to make amends. Ambassador Quinder moved through the crowd, speaking quietly to various groups and individuals. His diplomatic immunity gave him some protection, and he was using that protection to coordinate the peaceful resistance. "What you're witnessing," he said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "is the power of moral authority. These people have no weapons, no official authority, no legal standing to challenge the hegemony. But they have something more powerful. They know the difference between right and wrong." Captain Zexthal was growing desperate. His orders were clear: execute the prisoner and restore order. But there were now hundreds of people surrounding the cage, and they showed no signs of backing down. "Move them out of the way," he ordered. His enforcement squad, the officers, moved forward with riot control equipment, intending to forcibly disperse the crowd. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. The people in the protective circle didn't fight back or run away. Instead, they sat down. All of them, simultaneously, in a coordinated act of peaceful resistance. The enforcement officers stopped, unsure how to proceed. Their weapons and tactics were designed for dealing with violent resistance, not with people who simply refused to move. "Arrest them all," Zexthal ordered. "Sir," said one of the officers, "there are over 300 civilians here. We don't have facilities to detain that many people." "Then make room," Zexthal snapped. But even as he gave the order, more complications arose. The station's communication systems, which were supposed to be under hegemony control, began broadcasting. Again, Song Yuna had found a way to root around their blockade, and images of the peaceful protest were being transmitted across the galaxy on dozens of worlds. People were watching the standoff at Kepler Station. They saw hundreds of beings from multiple species sitting peacefully around a scared young girl, protecting her with nothing but their presence and their refusal to accept injustice. The images were powerful, and the response was immediate. Protests began forming on other worlds. Families of other hostages started coming forward with their stories. Trade unions announced boycotts of hegemony-controlled space. "Sir," another officer reported to Zexthal, "we're receiving reports of civil unrest on 15 different worlds. Multiple governments are calling for investigations into hegemony detention practices." The situation was spiraling out of control. What had started as a simple public punishment was becoming a galaxy-wide crisis for the hegemony. In the center of the plaza, Veltara looked out at the hundreds of people who had chosen to protect her. Her crystal skin was glowing with colors that no one had seen before, warm golds and bright silvers that seemed to radiate hope and love. "Why?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet crowd. "Why are you all willing to risk so much for someone you barely know?" It was Minho who answered, his voice simple and clear. "Because that's what family does," he said. "And your family now?" The words resonated through the crowd, translated into dozens of languages for the various species present. But the meaning was universal. When someone is in trouble, you don't abandon them. You stand with them. Captain Zexthal looked around at the sea of determined faces, at the news broadcasts that were making the hegemony look like cruel oppressors, at the reports of growing unrest throughout their territory. For the first time since arriving at Kepler Station, he began to understand that he might not win this fight. The power of simple human kindness, multiplied by the courage of beings from across the galaxy, was proving stronger than weapons, stronger than authority, stronger than fear. And in the center of it all, a scared young girl was learning that she was not alone in the universe after all. 3 days after Captain Zexthal had threatened to execute Veltara, the hegemony transport ships began leaving Kepler Station. They departed quietly, without fanfare or official announcements, but everyone on the station understood what their departure meant. The hegemony had backed down. The pressure from across the galaxy had become too great to ignore. Dozens of worlds were demanding investigations into the hostage-taking program. Trade boycotts were disrupting the hegemony's economic operations. Most importantly, their own personnel were beginning to question orders that required them to harm innocent people. The breaking point had come when Ambassador Quinder formally invoked the Galactic Sanctuary Protocol, a rarely used law that allowed diplomatic representatives to grant immediate asylum to individuals facing unjust persecution. Several other ambassadors from different species had joined him, creating an unprecedented coalition of diplomatic protection. Captain Zexthal had received orders to withdraw and await further instructions. As he prepared to leave, he approached the cage where Veltara had been imprisoned for over a week. "This isn't over," he said to her through his translator. "The hegemony doesn't forget those who defy authority." But Veltara was no longer the frightened, broken girl he had brought to the station. The days of kindness and support from hundreds of strangers had given her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Neither do we," she replied quietly. "We don't forget those who show us that the universe is full of good people." After the hegemony forces departed, the first priority was getting Veltara proper medical care. Choi Hyuk had been monitoring her condition throughout the ordeal, and while the shared meals had prevented serious damage, she still needed treatment for malnutrition and stress. As they carefully dismantled the energy cage that had held her for so long, Veltara took her first free steps in over a week. Her legs were shaky and she needed support, but she insisted on walking to the medical bay under her own power. "I want to remember what it feels like to choose where I go," she explained. The medical examination revealed what they had all suspected. Veltara was remarkably resilient, but she would need time to fully recover from her ordeal. More importantly, the psychological impact of her imprisonment would take longer to heal than the physical effects. But she wasn't healing alone. The community that had formed around her during the crisis didn't dissolve when the immediate danger passed. The bonds created through shared meals and shared courage had become something permanent and precious. Minho visited her in the medical bay every day, bringing food and conversation. Kim Nari helped her understand the legal proceedings that were beginning against the hegemony. Song Yuna kept her updated on news from across the galaxy, including reports about other hostages who were being freed thanks to the attention their case had generated. "Your story saved my brother," a young alien told Veltara during one of her visits to the plaza. The alien species was one that Veltara didn't recognize, but her gratitude was universal. He was being held on another station, and when people saw what happened here, they demanded his release too. Similar stories arrived daily. The evidence that Song Yuna had broadcast, combined with the dramatic footage from the standoff, had sparked investigations throughout hegemony space. The systematic hostage-taking program was being exposed and dismantled. Piece by piece, more than 50 innocent people were released in the first month after the Kepler Station incident. Families were reunited and the threat that had hung over anyone who refused to cooperate with hegemony, demands began to lose its power. But the changes went deeper than just the immediate rescues. Han Daeho had been right when he said that the story would spread through traitor networks. Merchants and travelers carried the tale to dozens of worlds, and each telling reinforced the same message. Ordinary people could stand up to injustice when they worked together. The phrase, "Come eat with me," became a symbol of welcome and protection. Throughout the galaxy, when refugees arrived on new worlds, locals would often greet them with those words and a shared meal. When someone was being treated unfairly, supporters would gather and eat together as a sign of solidarity. The cultural impact was especially strong among humans. The story of Park Min-ho, the maintenance worker who had sparked a galactic movement simply by sharing his lunch, became part of human folklore. Children learned about him in school. Adults told his story when they wanted to remind each other about the importance of small acts of kindness, but perhaps the most significant change was in how different species related to each other. The coalition that had formed to protect Veltara included beings from more than 20 different worlds. Many of them had never worked together before, and some had historical conflicts with each other. But they had discovered that their shared values were stronger than their differences. Ambassador Quinder helped formalize this cooperation by establishing the Interspecies Mutual Aid Society, an organization dedicated to protecting individuals who were being persecuted by authoritarian governments. The society's symbol was a simple image, beings from different species sharing a meal together. 6 months after her rescue, Veltara was finally reunited with her family. Her parents arrived at Kepler Station on a medical transport, having been granted safe passage by the coalition of worlds that now protected her. The reunion took place in the same plaza where she had been imprisoned, but the space had been transformed. The area where her cage had stood was now a garden, with plants from dozens of different worlds growing together in harmony. When Veltara saw her parents, her crystal skin blazed with colors that were so bright and beautiful that everyone in the plaza stopped to watch. The joy of a Catherian family reunion was something that transcended species barriers. "My daughter," her mother said, embracing her carefully. "We were so afraid we would never see you again." "I was afraid too," Veltara admitted. "But then I learned that family isn't just the people you're born with. Family is also the people who choose to love and protect you." She turned to look at the crowd that had gathered to welcome her parents. Minho was there, of course, along with Kim Nari, Song Yuna, Lee Ji-won, Choi Hyuk, and Han Dae-ho, but there were also dozens of others, aliens and humans who had become part of her extended family through acts of kindness and courage. "These people saved me," she told her parents. "Not just from imprisonment, but from despair. They showed me that the universe is full of good people who will stand up for what's right." Her father, who was also a medical professional, bowed deeply to the assembled crowd. "In our culture, there is no higher honor than being accepted as family by those who owe you nothing but choose to love you anyway. You have given our daughter the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that she is not alone." The celebration that followed lasted for hours. Food from across the galaxy was shared freely, and the plaza filled with music, conversation, and laughter. Children played games while adults shared stories and planned future cooperation. As the day wound down, Minho found himself sitting with Veltara and her parents in the garden that had replaced her cage. The contrast between this moment and the day he had first offered her food was overwhelming. "Do you ever regret it?" Veltara asked him. "Getting involved, I mean. You could have just walked past and continued with your normal life." Minho considered the question seriously. His life had certainly become more complicated. He now served on the advisory board of the Interspecies Mutual Aid Society, and he received regular updates about rescue operations and humanitarian efforts across the galaxy. He was no longer just a maintenance worker. He had become a symbol of human compassion and moral courage. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. What I would regret is knowing that I had the chance to help someone and chose not to. People have a saying," Veltara's mother said. "The light you kindle for others will always illuminate your own path." "Humans have a similar saying," Minho replied. "We believe that we're all connected to each other and that helping others is really just another way of helping ourselves." As the celebration continued around them, Veltara looked up at the stars visible through the station's transparent dome. Somewhere out there, the hegemony was still operating, still trying to maintain control through fear and intimidation. But they had lost something important on Kepler Station. They had lost the belief that ordinary people would always be too afraid to stand up for what was right. "The kindness grows," she said softly, using the phrase that had become her personal motto, and across the galaxy, in refugee camps and medical clinics, in trading posts and diplomatic chambers, in the homes of families who had been reunited and the hearts of individuals who had found the courage to help strangers, it was true. The kindness was growing, one shared meal at a time. The story that had begun with a simple invitation, "Come, eat with me," had become something larger than anyone could have imagined. It had become proof that the universe was full of good people, and that those good people could change the galaxy when they chose to act with courage and compassion. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all. Kindness is contagious. Courage is inspiring, and family is whoever chooses to stand with you when you need them most. The revolution had begun not with weapons or political movements, but with a maintenance